Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
For 3 decades, I had poured every ounce of my energy into serving the Harper family, convinced that they had swooped in like some kind of suburban saviors to rescue me from the shadowy void of an orphanage existence that they often painted in dramatic strokes during holiday toasts. Yet all the while my adoptive parents, Lydia and Robert, lavished their biological children, my brother Tom and sister Rebecca, with extravagant gifts, private school tuitions, and endless excuses for their every whim, leaving me to meticulously clean the greasy remnants from their plates after family dinners that stretched late into the night amid laughter and stories that always seemed to exclude me. And it was precisely at Grandfather Harlan's funeral, surrounded by the heavy drapes of the old community hall in our quiet Ohio town where neighbors gathered not just to mourn, but to size up the inheritance possibilities, that the entire illusion shattered when the family lawyer, Mr. Elias Grant, with his wire-rimmed glasses perched on a nose that had seen too many estate disputes, pulled me into a dimly lit corner away from the murmuring crowd and whispered urgently into my ear that I had not been adopted at all, but kidnapped as a wide-eyed toddler back in 1985 from a bustling park in California, that my real parents had never stopped searching through private detectives and public pleas splashed across national news outlets, and that a staggering $91 million reward still hung in the balance for whoever could reunite us, a revelation so earth-shattering that it made the room spin around me as if the polished wooden floors had suddenly tilted, forcing me to grip the edge of a nearby table laden with wilting flower arrangements and half-eaten finger sandwiches to steady myself against the wave of nausea rising from the pit of my stomach. Growing up in that unassuming two-story house on Maple Street, the kind of neighborhood where kids rode bikes until dusk, and barbecues marked every summer weekend with the smoky aroma of grilled burgers mingling with the chatter of gossip about who got the promotion or whose marriage was fraying at the edges, I had always positioned myself as the reliable backbone of the family, scrubbing the kitchen counters until they gleamed after Lydia's elaborate cooking sessions that she claimed were her artistic outlet, but really served to showcase her dominance over the household dynamics, while Tom barreled through his teenage years with a new sports car for his 16th birthday that Robert financed by dipping into the emergency fund I had painstakingly built from my part-time jobs at the local diner and later the bank, where I climbed the ranks through sheer grit and overtime hours that left me bone-tired on weekends, and Rebecca flitted about in designer outfits funded by loans from the family pot that she repaid with vague promises and eye rolls, all of it culminating in those endless evenings where I would stack the dirty dishes in the sink, scraping off the congealed bits of whatever gourmet disaster Lydia had whipped up that night, telling myself with a bitter internal chuckle that at least I was indispensable in a way their spoiled antics never could be. Though deep down the resentment simmered like a pot left too long on the stove, especially when they would pat me on the back and say how grateful I should be for the roof over my head and the chance at a normal life they had given me. The funeral service itself unfolded under a slate-gray sky that seemed to mirror the weight pressing on my chest as Harlan's casket, adorned with simple white lilies that he had always preferred over flashy displays, was lowered into the earth at the cemetery just outside town, where the wind whipped through the bare branches of the oaks lining the paths and carried snippets of eulogies, praising his role as the steadfast patriarch who built the construction business from nothing after the war. But even then I caught odd glances from him in my memories of his final hospital visits, his frail hand squeezing mine a little too tightly as if imparting some unspoken warning or apology that I dismissed as the ramblings of age, only to have Elias's words retroactively color every interaction with suspicion, making me replay scenes from my childhood like the time Lydia burned old photos in the backyard fire pit claiming they were just clutter, or how Robert always changed the subject whenever adoption agencies came up in conversation during those rare family game nights that devolved into arguments over board game rules. As the reception dragged on with aunts and uncles milling about the hall, exchanging hushed speculations about Harlan's will and who might get the old family cabin up in the lake country that had been the site of so many summer escapes where I pitched tents and cooked meals while the others lounged by the water, I found myself wandering toward the back room where Harlan's personal effects had been temporarily stored in cardboard boxes labeled in his precise handwriting, the air there musty with the scent of aged paper and faint cigar smoke that clung to everything he owned. And, compelled by a mix of curiosity and the lawyer's bombshell, I began sifting through the contents with trembling fingers, uncovering faded letters tied with string and a small leather-bound journal that hinted at deeper family secrets through cryptic entries about the girl we couldn't let go, my pulse quickening with each page turned until I discovered a locked metal box wedged beneath a stack of outdated ledgers, its surface cool and unyielding under my touch as I fumbled for a way to pry it open using a stray letter opener from the desk, the metallic scrape echoing softly in the empty space. But just as the latch gave way and a cascade of documents began to spill onto the floor, revealing glimpses of newspaper headlines about a long-ago missing child whose description eerily matched my own curly locks and hazel eyes, the unmistakable sound of footsteps approached from the corridor outside, deliberate and unhurried, pausing just beyond the door as if the intruder were listening for my next move, leaving me frozen in place with my breath caught in my throat, wondering if it was Tom come to pilfer something for his latest get-rich-quick scheme, or Lydia herself ready to spin another web of denial. And in that suspended moment the facade of my entire life hung by a thread, poised to unravel completely if whoever lurked there decided to push the door open and demand answers I wasn't yet prepared to give. Heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal desperate for escape as those footsteps lingered just outside the study door in the dim aftermath of the funeral reception. I quickly shoved the spilled documents back into the metal box and slid it under the desk with my foot, the scrape of wood on wood barely audible over the distant hum of conversations from the hall. And then the door creaked open to reveal not Tom or Lydia, but a sympathetic cousin who had wandered in looking for a quiet spot to compose herself. Her eyes red-rimmed from the service, as she apologized for startling me and shared a brief anecdote about Harlan's fondness for puzzles that left me wondering if he had been trying to piece together a confession for me in his final days, allowing me to slip away unscathed, but with the weight of those hidden papers burning in my memory like an itch I couldn't scratch until the house emptied and everyone retreated to their corners of denial. The following morning dawned with the kind of crisp autumn chill that seeped through the windows of our family home, prompting me to confront Lydia directly in the kitchen where she stood at the counter slicing fruit for a breakfast that no one but her would appreciate in its overly fussy presentation of yogurt parfaits and artisanal toast. And as I laid out the newspaper clipping from the box on the granite surface between us, the faded ink detailing the disappearance of a toddler named Emily Harrington from a San Francisco park, complete with a composite sketch that mirrored my own features down to the slight dimple in my chin, her knife paused mid-cut and her face paled to the shade of the milk she was about to pour, stammering excuses about how Harlan must have been senile in his later years to collect such morbid memorabilia when it was clearly just a coincidence born from his habit of hoarding clippings about lost causes. But the way her hands trembled as she resumed chopping betrayed the lie, reminding me of all those times she had deflected questions about my origins with tales of a heroic adoption process that now rang hollow as a bad check from one of Tom's business ventures. Pressing her further with the lawyer's revelation about the kidnapping and the $91 million reward that had accrued from the Harrington family's relentless campaigns through billboards, television appeals, and even a dedicated foundation for missing children, I watched her defenses crumble into a defensive tirade about how the Harpers had given me stability and love that no amount of money could buy, her voice rising in that familiar pitch of indignation she reserved for when Rebecca's credit card bills came due or Tom's latest excuse for unemployment fell flat, yet beneath it all I sensed the panic of someone guarding a fortress built on sand, especially since I had already started piecing together the mismatched adoption papers from the box, which listed no official agency but rather a vague notarization from a small-town clerk that screamed forgery to anyone with half a brain, fueling my resolve to dig deeper even as she begged me to drop it for the sake of family unity. A plea that struck me as hilariously ironic given how they had treated me like the hired help for 30 years while spoiling the others into entitled shells of adults. Meanwhile, Tom's interference at my job had escalated when he sauntered into the bank the previous week pretending to open an account, but really charming the manager into scrutinizing my performance reviews under the guise of brotherly concern. His smooth talk about how I was overworked and needed a vacation masking his true intent to leverage my position for a personal loan he had no intention of repaying, a move that nearly cost me a promotion I had earned through countless late nights reconciling accounts that included his own bounced checks. So, in a stroke of what I considered poetic justice wrapped in anonymity, I composed an email. From a generic tip line detailing the discrepancies in his car dealership's books that I had glimpsed during one of his visits to the office. Nothing fabricated, but enough embezzlement hints from padded expense reports to trigger an internal audit that hit him like a ton of bricks, just as he was bragging about a big sale over lunch. And the backfire came swiftly when he cornered me at home that evening with accusations flying wild about corporate sabotage, his face flushed red as he paced the living room rug that I had vacuumed just hours before, suspecting me because who else knew the intimate details of his shady dealings? A confrontation that almost made me crack a smile at the irony of him unraveling from the very web of deceit he had spun for years. Though it planted a seed of unease in me about how far I was willing to push this revenge before it consumed the remnants of whatever affection lingered in my heart. The tension boiled over at our obligatory post-funeral family dinner a few nights later, the dining room table groaning under the weight of takeout from the Italian place down the street because no one felt like cooking amid the grief. With Robert at the head nursing a beer and grumbling about estate taxes, while Tom shoveled pasta into his mouth between rants about unfair business practices. Rebecca picking at her salad with complaints about her husband's inattentiveness that conveniently ignored her own flirtations with the gym trainer, and Lydia serving seconds with forced cheer that masked her watchful eyes on me, the air thick with unspoken accusations until I excused myself to clear the plates as always, stacking them in the sink only to pause when I overheard snippets from the hallway where Lydia and Robert huddled by the phone, their voices low and conspiratorial as they discussed hiring their own lawyer to contest any claim I might make on the reward, arguing that Harlan's will could be interpreted to favor the true family line and that they had sacrificed too much to let some long-lost relatives swoop in now, words that twisted like a knife in my gut confirming their intent to cling to the fortune at my expense. But before I could burst back in and demand explanations, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket with an incoming call from an unknown number displaying a California area code, and when I answered in a hushed tone the voice on the other end, warm yet edged with urgency, introduced itself as a cousin from the Harrington side who had been monitoring the news of Harlan's passing and needed to warn me that the Harpers weren't the only ones with secrets, urging a discreet meeting before it was too late, only for the line to crackle and drop amid what sounded like interference, leaving me staring at the device in the dim kitchen light with a chill racing down my spine as I wondered who this person truly was and whether picking up that call had just invited a storm far bigger than the one brewing within my fractured family. With the mysterious call from the Harrington cousin still echoing in my ears like a half-heard whisper in a crowded room long after the line went dead, I spent the next day wrestling with the decision to reach out to Elias Grant again. Pacing the worn linoleum of my small apartment above the garage at the family home where the scent of motor oil from Robert's tools mingled with the faint mustiness of unpacked boxes from my last failed attempt at independence, ultimately dialing his office number under the guise of needing clarification on Harlan's will but really seeking a deeper dive into the legal labyrinth of reclaiming my identity and the $91 million reward that now felt less like a windfall and more like a Pandora's box of complications. His receptionist patching me through to a late afternoon meeting at a nondescript coffee shop on the outskirts of town where the aroma of fresh brews and pastries did little to ease the knot in my stomach as Elias arrived with a leather briefcase bulging with files and a cautious optimism in his eyes that suggested he had seen cases like this turn ugly more times than he cared to count. Settling into a corner booth away from the prying ears of the afternoon crowd of retirees nursing their lattes and debating local politics, he spread out documents detailing the Harringtons' exhaustive search efforts from the very day of my abduction. including police reports yellowed with age that described a frantic scene in Golden Gate Park where a nanny had turned her back for mere seconds only for the toddler in pigtails to vanish into the crowd, and as he pointed out how the reward fund had grown through investments tied to David Harrington's tech patents in Silicon Valley, painting a picture of a family shattered by loss yet sustained by hope that resonated with those American tales of perseverance against overwhelming odds. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions because allying with him meant stepping irrevocably away from the Harper's orbit, a dilemma that had me questioning if his polished assurances hid ulterior motives like a cut of the payout or leverage in some larger firm agenda, yet his genuine pause when I voiced those fears, admitting that trust in such matters was earned drop by drop, convinced me to proceed with gathering evidence like DNA samples and witness statements that could solidify my claim without alerting the family too soon. Back at the house that evening as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the backyard, where Rebecca and her husband Mark were hosting a casual barbecue to process the grief in their typical performative way with strings of fairy lights and a playlist of classic rock that blared from portable speakers, she sidled up to me near the grill where I flipped burgers out of habit while everyone else socialized with plastic cups of beer in hand, her arm linking through mine in a sudden display of sisterly affection that reeked of calculation given how she had ignored my calls during Harlan's illness, cooing about how we needed to stick together now more than ever and that any silly rumors from the funeral were just stress talking. Her words laced with probing questions about what Elias had really said that made my blood run cold because it was clear she was angling to gauge how much I knew and perhaps spin it back to Lydia for damage control. A manipulation so transparent it almost made me laugh out loud at the bull of her sudden warmth when, just last month, she had borrowed my vacuum cleaner without returning it amid complaints about my cluttered space. Seizing the opportunity for a revenge that struck at the heart of her hypocrisy without direct confrontation, I waited until after the gathering dispersed with hugs and promises of more family time that rang as false as her diamond earrings. Then from the privacy of my apartment crafted an anonymous post on the local community Facebook group describing a hypothetical neighborhood drama involving a wife sneaking off to the gym for more than workouts with the trainer who moonlighted as a personal coach, weaving in just enough specific details like the red sports car parked suspiciously often and the late-night texts that lit up screens during dinner parties to make it unmistakably point to her affair without naming names. A witty indirect jab that spread like wildfire through our tight-knit circle by morning as evidenced by the flurry of private messages and raised eyebrows at the grocery store, watching her squirm when Mark confronted her over breakfast with a stony silence that promised marital fireworks, while she shot me accusatory glances across the table at our next impromptu lunch. The chaos it stirred satisfying in its clever precision, yet leaving me with a twinge of regret, because exposing her folly inevitably rippled out to hurt Mark, who had always been decent if oblivious. A choice that might have audiences siding against my growing ruthlessness. 4. Dismantling relationships that, flawed as they were, formed the fragile glue of our shared history. The real gut punch came later that week when, driven by Elias's advice to document everything, I ventured into the attic of the main house under the pretense of sorting Harlan's belongings. The space cluttered with holiday decorations and forgotten furniture, draped in sheets that billowed like ghosts in the draft from a cracked skylight. My flashlight beam cutting through the dust motes to illuminate an old steamer trunk pushed to the far corner behind stacks of boxed Christmas lights and, prying it open with a crowbar borrowed from Robert's toolbox, revealed not just faded linens, but a hidden compartment containing a single photograph of a young couple cradling a baby girl on a sunny porch that overlooked what looked like the Harrington estate. From the files, the woman's smile radiant and the man's arm protectively around them both in a way that mirrored my own lost innocence. The image, so visceral it brought tears to my eyes as I pocketed it for safekeeping, only to hear the attic stairs creak under approaching weight that turned out to be Robert climbing up with a concerned frown, claiming he had noticed the light from below and wanted to help. But as we sat amid the relics, his facade cracked under my pointed questions about the photo and the inconsistencies in my adoption story, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper as he admitted partial knowledge from the beginning. When Lydia brought me home in a panic, insisting it was an accident born of desperation during their infertility struggles, but that they had covered it up to give me a better life away from the media circus, begging me with watery eyes to stay silent for the sake of the family they had built around me, his demand hanging heavy in the air like a chain I could either break or wear forever. But before I could respond, my phone buzzed insistently in my pocket with a text from the cousin providing coordinates for an urgent meeting on the edge of town, the message warning that time was running out before the Harpers mobilized to bury the truth once and for all. Pocketing the phone with its ominous coordinates burning in my mind like a lit fuse after Robert's attic confession that hung between us unresolved as he shuffled back down the stairs muttering about letting sleeping dogs lie in that folksy way he had of dodging accountability. I knew sleep would evade me that night in the cramped confines of my apartment where the walls seemed to close in with memories of every unappreciated chore and sideline dream, so by the time the clock ticked past midnight, I had already zipped up a duffel bag stuffed with essentials like the photo from the trunk, a few changes of clothes pilfered from the laundry hamper to avoid suspicion, and the Harrington file Elias had copied for me during our coffee shop huddle. Slipping out the back door under the cover of a light drizzle that pattered against the leaves like whispered warnings before starting the engine of my reliable old sedan that had carried me through countless errands for the family without so much as a thank you. The dashboard lights casting a greenish glow on my determined face as I merged onto the interstate heading east toward Pennsylvania, where the cousin's message promised answers, but delivered only the hum of tires on wet asphalt and the gnawing uncertainty of leaving the only home I had known for a phantom family that might reject me as much as the Harpers had exploited me. The drive stretched into hours of monotonous highway flanked by billboards advertising diners and motels that evoked those classic road trip stories of self-discovery Americans love to romanticize in movies about midlife awakenings. Yet for me it was laced with paranoia that escalated when I spotted the same dark SUV in my rearview mirror twice within 50 miles. Its tinted windows hiding whoever was tailing me, but the persistent presence screaming opportunist drawn by whispers of the $91 million reward that had probably leaked through Elias's network or worse, a Harper plant sent to drag me back before I could claim what was rightfully mine, prompting me to pull off at a crowded truck stop buzzing with semis and weary travelers grabbing coffee and burgers under fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets, where I ducked into the women's restroom to call Elias from a payphone for the first time in years, his voice crackling with concern as he confirmed the bounty hunter rumors and advised evasive maneuvers like swapping rides if possible, which I managed by sweet talking a fellow driver into a quick exchange for his pickup truck parked out back in exchange for gas money, shaking the tail with a burst of speed down a side road that left me laughing nervously at the absurdity of turning my life into a low-budget thriller while questioning if this pursuit was worth the constant knot of fear twisting in my gut. To fund the rest of the journey and deliver a revenge that pinched the Harpers where it hurt without tipping my hand too soon, I logged into the joint family account from the truck's cracked bench seat using the Banks app on my phone during a brief stop at a scenic overlook where the rain had cleared to reveal rolling hills dotted with farmhouses that reminded me of simpler family vacations I had organized but rarely enjoyed. Transferring a modest sum of $5,000 earmarked for household expenses into a new personal account I had quietly opened weeks earlier, then wiring half of it to a missing children's charity as ironic nod to the cause my absence had bolstered for decades, the transaction slick and untraceable enough to crimp their lifestyle, like canceling Rebecca's spa days or Tom's bar tabs without immediate detection. A clever bit of payback that had me chuckling at the thought of Lydia's face when the statements arrived showing their safety net frayed by the very daughter they had undervalued. Though the ethical twinge hit hard because dipping into shared funds felt like stealing from the pot I had filled. More than anyone, a morally gray choice that audiences might condemn as too vengeful for someone on the cusp of fortune when honest confrontation could have sufficed, yet in the heat of betrayal it seemed like fair play in a game they had rigged from the start. Subtle clues to my true origins accumulated like puzzle pieces snapping into place during the lulls in driving, such as the jagged scar on my knee from a childhood fall that matched a detail in an old news clipping Elias emailed about the park abduction, where the toddler had scraped her leg on a playground slide moments before vanishing. Or the haunting melody of a lullaby Lydia used to hum while tucking me in that now echoed the cassette tape in the Harrington file recorded by Margaret during my early years, those connections building an electric tension that kept my foot heavy on the accelerator and my eyes scanning for more shadows, heightening the anticipation of reunion with every mile marker passed until I pulled into the rundown motel on the Pennsylvania Turnpike as dusk fell, the neon sign flickering vacancy, like a reluctant invitation where Sarah Harrington, the cousin from the call, waited in room 12 with a thermos of coffee and a stack of documents spread across the sagging bedspread, her wiry frame and sharp features bearing a familial resemblance that made my breath catch as she enveloped me in a hug scented with vanilla and resolve, launching into the story of how Lydia, a distant acquaintance from a charity event, had impulsively snatched me during a moment of unchecked envy over the Harringtons' picture-perfect life amid their own struggles with infertility and financial woes in the construction slump of the 80s. An accidental crime born of desperation that spiraled into a lifelong cover-up with Harlan's reluctant complicity to shield the family from scandal. As we pored over birth certificates and timelines late into the night over sandwiches from the motel's vending machine that tasted like cardboard but fueled our urgent discussion about next steps like a DNA test to seal the reward claim and a drive to the Harrington estate upstate where Margaret and David awaited with guarded hope after years of false leads. Sarah's demeanor shifted to unease when she mentioned recent strange occurrences like hang-up calls and a prowler spotted near the family home, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed a key into my palm for the estate gates with instructions to arrive at dawn. But just as I nodded and gathered my things, the sharp rap of knuckles on the thin door shattered the quiet, followed by muffled voices outside identifying themselves as concerned relatives from Ohio come to ensure my safety before I wandered too far from home. The implication clear that the Harpers had tracked me down and were closing in to reclaim their stolen prize. Heart slamming against my chest like a drum in a parade gone wrong as Sarah and I froze at the motel's door with those insistent voices from the Harpers pressing their fabricated concern through the thin wood panel that seemed to vibrate with their urgency. We exchanged a frantic glance before she motioned me toward the back window where the pickup truck idled in the shadows of the parking lot under a canopy of dripping pines that masked our movements from the headlights sweeping the lot, and slipping out into the cool night air thick with the scent of wet earth and exhaust, we piled in and peeled away down a service road that Sarah navigated from memory, having grown up dodging family drama in these backwoods. The deputies or whoever the Harpers had dispatched turning out to be a bluff when no sirens wailed in pursuit, but the close call left me gripping the door handle with white-knuckled resolve as we merged back onto the highway toward upstate New York where the Harrington estate awaited like a beacon or a trap depending on how the night unfolded. The hours blurring into a tense vigil of shared stories where Sarah recounted the Harringtons' unyielding grief from the day of the abduction onward, with Margaret channeling her pain into advocacy work that funded search teams and David burying himself in boardrooms to grow the reward pot through savvy investments that turned their tech empire into a fortress of hope, tales that painted them not as distant tycoons but as everyday parents shattered by a whim that stole their only child, making me wonder with a wry internal chuckle if the Harpers' version of family was just the flip side of that coin, all dysfunction and denial wrapped in the comfort of routine lies. Arriving at the estate just as the first hints of dawn streaked the sky in pale pinks and golds over manicured lawns that stretched like a green ocean toward a sprawling stone mansion reminiscent of those old money retreats in glossy magazines where American dreams of legacy mingled with the isolation of wealth. I hesitated at the wrought iron gates with Sarah's hand steady on my shoulder, urging me forward, because this threshold marked the point of no return from the life I had scraped together amid the Harper scraps. And as the gates swung open with a mechanical hum that echoed my pounding pulse, we were ushered inside by a housekeeper whose kind eyes held the weight of long-held secrets, leading us through echoing halls lined with portraits of Harrington ancestors whose stern gazes seemed to appraise my every step until we reached the sunlit study, where Margaret and David rose from leather armchairs by a crackling fireplace, their faces etched with the lines of decades marked by loss yet lighting up with tentative joy as they enveloped me in embraces that smelled of lavender and aged wood. The reunion unfolding in a torrent of questions and tears where they described the endless nights scanning faces in crowds and the media frenzy that had turned their private agony into public spectacle, confirming through old home videos and baby photos that the curly-haired girl in the park was indeed me, Emily Harrington, not Harper. Their voices breaking as they explained how the reward had started as a modest plea but snowballed into $91 million through compound interest and donations from sympathizers moved by their stories splashed across Dateline episodes and missing persons galas. No sooner had the emotional haze begun to lift with offers of tea and promises of time to adjust than the front door burst open downstairs with the clamor of uninvited arrivals. Robert and Lydia storming in, flanked by a flustered butler and a sputtering Elias, who had arrived earlier to handle the legal formalities. The Harpers' faces a mask of righteous indignation as Robert bellowed about how I belonged with them, and this was all a kidnapping hoax perpetrated by greedy opportunists. Lydia's eyes wild with a mix of fear and defiance that cracked when she saw the family resemblance staring back from my position beside Margaret. The room descending into chaos with overlapping accusations where David demanded they leave his property and Sarah dialed for security while I stood frozen absorbing the surreal showdown that felt like a bad episode of those Family Feud reality shows where buried resentments erupt in living rooms across suburbia. In the midst of the uproar, Lydia collapsed into a chair, clutching her chest with sobs that peeled back the final layers of deception as she confessed the full truth in halting bursts, admitting that the kidnapping had been an impulsive act born from a desperate haze during a charity picnic where she spotted me toddling near the Harringtons' setup, overwhelmed by their effortless bliss, while her own marriage crumbled under infertility woes and Robert's gambling debts in the shaky economy of the mid-'80s, snatching me in a blind moment thinking a child would glue their fracturing world back together, only for panic to set in and Harlan to help bury the evidence with forged papers and a story of adoption that they sold to themselves as a mercy, saving me from a life of privilege's cold spotlight. Her words laced with regret that the spoiling of Tom and Rebecca had been twisted compensation for the guilt eating at her every time she saw my face, a reminder of the theft. A revelation so raw it humanized her villainy and forced a reluctant empathy from me even as the room fell silent with the weight of it all, Robert nodding grimly beside her as if sharing the burden absolved them of the decades of servitude they had imposed on me like a penance I never asked for. Seizing the moment for my ultimate revenge that would echo far beyond these walls without stooping to their level of outright cruelty, I turned to Elias, who had been quietly recording the exchange on his phone with Margaret's nod of approval, and instructed him to compile it into a press release for immediate distribution to major outlets like the New York Times and CNN, framing the Harpers not as monsters, but as tragic figures whose desperate choice had hoarded a fortune meant for reunion while exposing their deception in a way that triggered investigations into their finances and disowned Tom and Rebecca from any inheritance claims. A witty public unmasking that went viral within hours, painting me as the resilient survivor reclaiming her narrative and satisfying the burn of 30 years' worth of cleaned plates and overlooked dreams with a clever stroke that left them scrambling to explain to neighbors and creditors alike. Though the triumph soured slightly as calls flooded in from a hysterical Rebecca begging forgiveness and Tom threatening lawsuits that dissolved into pleas, the fallout making me question if this scorched earth approach had destroyed more than it healed, because mercy might have mended some fractures where my vengeance only widened the chasms. As the legal wheels turned with the reward transferring seamlessly into accounts under my control, and the Harringtons extended invitations to stay and rebuild amid their genuine, if awkward, overtures of parenthood that felt both warming and overwhelming after so long in the shadows, I chose instead to slip away that afternoon, driving aimlessly through the winding roads of the countryside where autumn leaves swirled like unanswered questions, the $91 million a heavy anchor rather than liberating wings in my possession as I pondered the ambiguity of it all, because if family was neither the blood ties severed by impulse nor the adoptive bonds forged in deception, then what threads remained to weave a new life from the tatters, leaving me adrift with the haunting wonder of the girl I might have become in that untouched California childhood, forever lost to the what-ifs that no amount of money or miles could fully reclaim.